All right, everybody, welcome back to Philosophy for the People. Hey, it's been a while since I've done anything on this channel. I've been so busy, let alone hosted a discussion. But here we are. We're back, and I've got Dr. Brian Besong joining me again. It's been a couple of years since you've been on the show, so it's great to have you back.
Thanks.
We've got Amos Wollen here, and we're going to have a talk about natural law, and I guess we're going to talk about sex. Why not start with the clickbait at some point? Keep people interested and engaged. I have no particular agenda. I just wanted to host and moderate and somewhat facilitate the conversation between these two gentlemen. I warned them beforehand, as I warned the audience. I'm just getting over the flu, which means I'm not really over it. So if I look kind of like weird and I disappear every now and then, has nothing to do with you guys. But I wasn't going to miss the opportunity to host this discussion. So here we are. I won't waste any more time. Let's dive right in with just some very brief introductions. Brian, for you, it's a reintroduction. Amos, this is your first time here, so I want to make sure that the audience knows who you are before we begin. Brian, let's start with you, then we'll go to Amos.
Yeah, so my name is Brian Besong, and I got my PhD at Purdue University in 2013. Since then, my research is largely focused on natural law moral theory. I'm currently the editor of the Journal of Natural Law, published by Catholic University Press, Catholic University of America Press, and its first issue, inaugural issue, will be forthcoming in fall of this year. So I have a book on natural law, an introduction to natural law, which was published in I want to say 2019, and then a forthcoming book with Paul Grave entitled Sex and Theory, which tries to argue that natural law is the only competent account of sexual ethics, that all other prevailing theories right now end up with crazy conclusions.
Great, thank you. Amos, a little bit about yourself, if you don't mind.
Yeah, congrats on the journal, by the way. It sounds really exciting.
Oh, thanks.
So I'm much less exciting. I'm a third-year undergrad at Oxford. I have a Substack called Going AWOL, where I talk about philosophy, ethics, philosophy of religion, analytic theology. If you subscribe to Pat's Substack, you might like mine.
Thanks for the plug, brother. Appreciate it.
I try to publish things here and there, but I'm mostly just focusing on my exams right now. That's all there is to me.
Hey, man, don't sell yourself short. Brian specifically thought you would be a very interesting and fun guy to chat with, which I think is a great compliment. So it's good to have you here. And I know we want to kind of like get into the specifics and the weeds of sexual ethics. That's all the fun stuff. But Brian, I think it would be helpful maybe if you just gave the audience a general overview. Hey, what is natural law? However you want to introduce it, just to kind of set the stage or the fundamentals for the conversation going forward, as much or as little as you think is helpful. Floor is yours, my friend. Yep.
Okay, great. So natural law moral theory, I think, is the theory with the most ancient pedigree and prestigious lineage of any moral theory. You see its origins in Plato and Aristotle, but it was especially developed by the Stoics and picked up by later Christian philosophers. Most natural lawyers today focus a little bit more on the historical details, but my training is contemporary analytic philosophy. And so when I think natural law, I don't necessarily think the history of the view or what Thomas says about something, but I think about how it works. And so in its simplest form, what it's looking for is for individuals to direct their natural powers towards the end of each of the natural powers. And the reason this is important is because human happiness, human flourishing, and fulfillment is best explained by the satisfaction of those natural powers. And so we as individual human beings are aimed at our own happiness, and how we get there is by using our natural powers in their natural ways, and directing them towards their ends is how we attain happiness. And so that's a simple overview of the theory. And it has, some kind of complicated aspects and some fairly simple aspects. One of the most simple takeaways is that we can never lie, because it involves using the power of communication towards an end other than its natural one. But I think some of the more complicated things, especially about sex, will come out in discussion with Amos.
Amos, anything you want to just add or say about that, or should we just keep moving forward here?
No. I thought maybe what might be helpful is if you kind of set up the natural law pathway to the kind of interesting sexual prohibitions on intrinsically non-procreative acts like contraception, gay sex, masturbation, and then I could just ask some questions and we can go from there.
Great.
Yeah,
the less work I have to do, Amos, the better. I appreciate it, brother. And again, not that I'm not interested, but go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, so as far as sex is concerned, natural law has perhaps the most prudish and traditional account of sexual ethics. Essentially, the natural sexual power is directed towards procreation, and what that means is that any sexual act which is deliberately or operationally aimed away from procreation is morally wrong. That can include, that includes pretty much the gamut of sexual acts partaken in the West. If I were to say the ratio, I'd probably guess like it's probably like 10-1 bad to good in terms of actual proper uses of the sexual power currently engaged in by Westerners. But so there's a lot of things you can do. Other than that, procreation is the end, and it also puts circumstantial constraints on what acts are appropriate. Namely, because procreation is the end, we should be only engaging in sexuality within a marriage, because a marriage provides circumstances appropriately conducive to successful procreation. Yeah, we could say more about that. I mean, there's we can get a little bit more in the weeds than that, but that's a nice overview.
Let me throw something out there, and you guys can decide which direction you want to go if you think it would be more interesting or helpful. This is for both of you. Do you think because Brian, you made a statement initially, which is sort of central to your book, that natural law is the only competent theory, right, over the sexual domain. And of course, it gets a lot of pushback, right, in the sexual domain. So do you think it would facilitate or serve this discussion to spend a little bit of time on some of the issues with the alternatives that might not always be at at the top of mind for people, or should we just keep going down the natural law path for now? That's an open question for both you guys. Yeah.
In the book, I survey so many moral theories that I would struggle.
Can't do them all, of course.
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
Right. So if Amos wants to, if Amos has a preferred moral alternative, we can kind of go with that. The last time I had a discussion that was kind of pertaining to sex, I was talking to Dustin Crummett, who really likes contractualism, and so. But contractualism is not everyone's cup of tea. Basically, it seems like although not all moral theories had embraced the gamut of current Western mores, many of the theories were open to be retooled. And so, for instance, Bentham, although Bentham had originally, in his defense of utilitarianism, endorsed pederasty, and in fact, he has a tract defending pederasty by that name, not homosexuality. He's often treated as prescient because he was defending homosexual behavior in what was that, the 18th century. And so, although Bentham kind of alludes to possible ways in which utilitarianism could be retooled, it wasn't as obvious that other moral theories could be so quickly adapted to justify contemporary sexual mores of the West. But it turns out that all of those theories have been, whether they were capable of it or not, they have been adapted to contemporary progressive mindsets. And so what I argue is that those adaptations open the door to homosexuality, masturbation. And I think that was really the goal, is those two things, maybe a little swinging, I don't know, like if they were aiming at little bit of progression, that was the progress that was aimed at. But my argument is that when they did that, they didn't close the door, and the door is now open to a variety of other acts, which I think are the wrongness Armorian truths. Namely, they're currently open to bestiality, consensual incest, sexualized cannibalism and necrophilia, among other acts. And I think that the wrongness of each of these is a Morian truth.
Okay, good. No further comment here. We can pursue that as it becomes relevant. But Amos?
Yeah, I mean, so just to comment on theories and stuff. I mean, I'm not a contractualist. I My leaning is to some kind of Rossian pluralism. So this view is deontological. So it says you can't kill one to save two. So there are some deontic constraints on action. So I'm not a consequentialist, but I'm not an absolutist deontologist. So I think, killing one person to save some arbitrarily large number of people would at some point be both permissible and obligatory. And I don't specify where that cutoff is, just like you can't specify when the cutoff between stubble and a beard is, but it's somewhere. And so that's sort of the view of morality I'm attracted to. It's not immediately obvious from that what the application to sex would be. So I mean, I can list some of the bells and whistles that I'd be open to using when kind of thinking about sexual ethics. So, you know, one of the things is obviously going to be consent. That will be involved on anyone's view. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition on permissible sex. Another will. I'm a theist, so I think that if God commands something that wasn't antecedently wrong, He could make it wrong for you to do. So, like, God could command me to drive on the right instead of on the left, even though it wasn't previously wrong to drive on the left. God could make it wrong. I give some credence to views on which something like universalizability or an optimific rule, if internalized by the vast majority of everyone, those kinds of views like rule consequentialism or contractualism, even though I'm not sold on them. And so that could potentially justify some conservative sexual prohibitions. Like if you look in Brad Hooker's book on rule consequentialism, he has a bit at the end where he talks about how rule consequentialism, at least prior to the advent of contraception, could have been used to justify a prohibition on premarital sex, because the best rule for society for people to follow is going to be one on which people don't have premarital sex, given the consequences. And then there might be considerations. So there will be considerations on respectful sex. So sometimes people can consent to things that are disrespectful, and you still shouldn't do them. There'll be potentially constraints on objectification. There'll also be virtue theoretic reasons not to have certain kinds of sex. So, presumably, even a consequentialist will want to develop certain kinds of virtues. So you want to develop the right kinds of moral heuristics going forward, because you won't always be able to pull out a calculator every time you want to give someone a compliment. And so developing the right kinds of virtues in sex, as with everything else, is going to be relevant. There will be a few other things too, but there are lots of considerations I'm happy to pull on when thinking about which kinds of sex are right or not.
So just to focus on the deontic constraints, because those seem like the most important for closing the door on, you might say, crazy sex. Well, I guess that crazy sex is probably not the right moniker, because maybe that's disrespectful sex. But here I'm thinking, like, what's a nice title for stuff that we know is wrong, like consensual incest, bestiality. Should we call that crazy sex? That sounds like wild sex.
I guess we might want to call them taboo sex, because I'm not always going to accept that these acts are intrinsically wrong.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when I give you that list of what I think are the wrongness of each of those things was a Morian truth, do you disagree with any of those? Do you think that those are permitted?
Yeah, my view will be that sometimes some of them are permitted, but it
All
can
of them,
still be.
or just some of them?
Sorry, could you list them again? So I remember consensual incest, necrophilia,
sexualized cannibalism.
Sexualized
someone getting off by eating someone else's body.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. I'm gonna say like there are going to be far-flung cases in which all of them are permissible, and many of them will not be cases that you'd often encounter in the actual world.
Okay. So, so the deontic constraints are going to be the ones that I guess you're not going to really need them, because it's going to be circumstances. None of those are absolutely wrong.
Yeah, so none of those action types are absolutely wrong. But some of them might be pro tanto wrong. We can consider that just as types of actions, and some of them might be wrong for contingent reasons, which sort of tend to cluster around those types of actions.
Okay.
But I mean, so I was thinking we could get back to my views on sexual ethics in a bit, but I was wondering if we could consider natural law theory and consider it internally, right? So
Mhm.
you could be having this debate with anyone, someone with a
Yeah,
completely different
right.
ethical theory, right? And so the types of criticisms that I'm going to level are the ones that could be leveled by anyone, including new natural law theorists or people with much more conservative sexual ethical views. Um, so yeah, why don't we consider whether natural law theory actually does have these kinds of conservative implications?
Okay.
Um, yeah, so a so when I started looking into natural law theory, I was kind of determined um, not to sort of fall prey to the kinds of counterexamples that classical natural law theorists traditionally have dismissed in a couple of sentences, like chewing gum or Diet Coke, things like that.
Walking on your hands.
Yeah, so my thought going in was like there may be counterexamples to these views, but the traditional ones that are traditionally dismissed won't be very good. But then I sort of started thinking about what natural law theorists have said, and with respect to some of them, it's not obvious to me still how you can say uphold the permissibility of chewing sugarless gum and also get the conservative sexual views. So I'm kind of convinced that um, the most plausible outworking of classical natural law theory will imply that it's okay to chew sugarless gum, but it's not clear to me that you can have that result and have the result that contracepted, homosexual, and masturbatory types of sex are categorically wrong.
Okay.
It might be helpful to spend a moment
Mhm.
explaining why that is an
Yeah,
objection that you
yeah.
sometimes hear. One of you two, if you could please do that for the audience, would be great
I
for
mean,
me.
I could give it, and then Brian could sort of give what he takes to be the explanation for why chewing gum is okay on natural law theory.
Sounds good.
So yeah, but people might be listening to this and thinking, oh, he's just confused what natural law theorists think natural is. He's saying, any artificial product like chewing gum is going to be wrong in natural law theory. Yeah, so
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
not the challenge.
Yeah, I know that isn't the case
Yeah,
with either of you. I'm just mostly concerned. I'm trying to balance two
yeah,
audiences here.
yeah,
Like, there's one side of my audience that's going to want to get super in the weeds, and there's one side of the audience is like, this is the first time they ever heard of natural law, so it's
yeah.
impossible to do it perfectly, but I'll do the best I can. Right? So yeah, keep
Sure.
going. Yeah.
I mean, yeah. So here's how these counterexamples are sort of supposed to work, at least prima facie, right? So, I'm currently drinking a Diet Coke. Diet Coke doesn't have any nutrition to speak of, and the caffeine will mean that it doesn't hydrate me because it will end up flushing more liquid out of my system than it puts in. And so, you might sort of do a natural law analysis of the faculty of imbibing or drinking, and so you might say, okay, like the purpose is to hydrate you, and in the case of drinking things like smoothies, it's also going to be to give you nutrients. And a similar thing might be said of chewing gum, right? So you might initially think, okay, like the faculty of chewing is for breaking things down so that you can ingest them and gain nutrients, and that's the point. And so the worries about these sorts of things is that chewing gum and Diet Coke don't give you any nutrients, and they don't break down, and they don't hydrate you. And typically, the reason that people chew chewing gum and drink Diet Coke is for the sake of pleasure. It's pleasant to chew chewing gum, that's why people do it, and it's pleasant to drink Diet Coke, and that's why people do it. And so the worry is going to be like, okay, sure, an end, at least one end of like the sexual act is reproductive, but you might think in the same way, like masturbation is using the sexual organ for an end other than the procreative end, namely the end of pleasure. Just as when you chew gum, you're using your sort of nom 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 faculties for the sake of pleasure, not for the sake of the things we might traditionally assume is the purpose of that faculty. So I guess Brian, like, how do you treat chewing gum on natural law, and then we can kind of ping back and see if we can uphold the traditional
Yeah. So,
position.
and I guess you kind of indirectly brought up a second
Mhm.
counterexample, and that is drinking Diet Coke.
Yeah, I take them
Yeah.
to be in
So
the same category, like they're kind of structurally similar counterexamples.
yeah. So, I guess maybe I'll start with the Diet Coke because that was the order of explanation. First Diet
Sure.
Coke, then sugar-free chewing gum. So I guess I'm doubtful that Diet Coke has zero nutrients, and even if it's diuretic, I guess I don't see that as being counterproductive. So it can be like diuretic medications are useful for the body if the body is retaining, too much hydration. And so, like, for instance, if a person had mild edema, then a diuretic medication would be, useful, beneficial. So I guess I'd want to deny that there's literally no, you might say, useful contribution of Diet Coke. Now, of course, I think most people who are drinking Diet Coke are doing so for the caffeine. And so that would be, so even as a diuretic, I'd say it's still satisfying the natural power of drinking, which I think is hydration, among other things. I think it's just the health of the body. And so hydration contributes to health in a different way than, say, nourishment does. But the health of the body is the goal of both. And so I would say Diet Coke may be less well directed towards the health of the body than, say, drinking green tea here, or water or beer. But it's still contributing, and so consequently, it's not using the natural power of drinking towards an end opposite or fundamentally different from the goal that it should be aimed at. So I think Diet Coke is fine. I don't like it, but not for moral reasons.
Sure.
And so what I would say is that there's similar things to be said about sugar-free gum, namely that salivation is good for dental health. And so I consider this an abortive act of eating. And so it's either an abortive act of eating or it's a completed act of eating. And so I'm open to it. I think it depends on some empirical circumstances. So it turns out that saliva actually has digestive effects. And so you can actually partially digest things merely by chewing them. And so it could be that you have digested everything. Now, it may not be much in the gum, but there are gum bases which are digested in a piece of sugar-free chewing gum. This is one of the reasons why people notice that the chewing gum goes from, like enjoyable to chew to suddenly tacky and kind of disgusting. And so then people spit it out. I would say that's the spitting it out is either an aborted act of eating. So it's just like an incomplete act of eating, and an incomplete act of eating is not wrong because there could be reasons to stop eating. So for instance, if I get a phone call and I need to stop eating right away, I can abort that act of eating without using the power to a different end. I've just stopped using the power. And again, like I say, I'm open to one or the other, because I guess the question is whether all of the digestible elements in sugar-free gum have been digested already just by chewing them. And I don't know the empirical details.
Mm-hmm.
And so otherwise you are digesting everything that's worth digesting in that gum. And it's aimed at your overall, digestive health insofar as it increases salivation, and salivation is good for reducing cavities. Oh, my lights just went out.
Yeah.
Sorry, I gotta do some body movements here there we go. Yeah, I'm curious how you would respond to that, if you think that's satisfying.
So I guess it is okay. It might be satisfying in one sense. So if we were worried about people's acts of chewing gum and drinking Diet Coke in the actual world,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't think it's going to be a satisfying kind of response in defense of the theory, because we can just sort of stipulate some of these empirical skirmishes away, right? So conceivably, there's a gum that someone could make that didn't have any of the positive dental effects or nutritive effects, and we could conceive of a type of fizzy drink that doesn't actually have any nutritional value. And instead of working as a diuretic, where like it gives you a bit of hydration for a short amount of time and then flushes more water out than you take in, you can imagine that like the water just like it sort of goes down your gullet and then it evaporates in a way that's not uncomfortable, that you don't notice. And so it's just as pleasant as drinking a regular thing of Diet Coke. So I think that people's intuitions about the permissibility of doing these kinds of morally neutral seeming acts won't hinge on the precise empirical details of what's in your chewing gum or what's in your Diet Coke. They're responding to until you supplied those empirical correctives, people in the audience might have kind of believed what I'd said about Diet Coke and chewing gum not having any nutritional effect. And what I was hoping that they'd have the intuition was that even given that fact, it's permissible to chew chewing gum and drink Diet Coke. Right, and so like that's the intuition that I'm playing on, not an intuition about actual world chewing gum, but an intuition about chewing gum that's sort of made in a certain way, or Diet Coke that's made in a certain way.
Yeah, so I guess I'm not convinced that the intuitions in the more artificial case are going to be useful to us because they're highly stipulative, and I'm not sure that they're close enough in. I don't know. I guess I don't like having possible worlds that are too distant from us and intuitions about those possible worlds being used as leverage against the theory. And so I'm not convinced that there would be either a drink that does what you've said in our world or a gum like that. And so if there is a possible world in which there is an entirely neutral gum, it doesn't even cause you to salivate, or an entirely neutral drink, it doesn't absorb in any way. I'd say that world is sufficiently distant from ours that any intuitions about it are not going to be very telling for or against any theory. So it may be that people had the intuition that it was not nutritionally beneficial. But then again, I don't know how useful that would be in this case, because I think the underlying intuition, the one that people are stronger in their convictions about, is that chewing sugar-free gum and drinking Diet Coke are probably fine. And so I think that's the real intuition, is that they're probably fine. And I can explain what I think is the stronger intuition.
Sure. So here's an analogy for what I think, the content of the audience's intuition really was, right? So suppose I led you to believe, okay, that there's no one in my room with epilepsy, and then I flashed a torch, right? Flash, flash, flash. So I would expect the audience, given that empirical setup, to have the intuition that there's nothing wrong with me flashing my torch. There's nothing wrong with me doing strobe lights. But then, suppose you reply, actually, there is someone in your room who has epilepsy. Then people's judgments about the case will change in light of the change in empirical facts. But I take it that like initially their intuition about the strobe lights was reliable given the facts that I set up, namely like if there were no one in my room with epilepsy, then it would be okay to flash strobe lights. And what I'm suggesting is that if Extra or one of these chewing gum companies just change the ingredients of their sticks of gum slightly, on your view, it will turn out, I think, given the kind of response you've given, that chewing gum is not only wrong, but categorically wrong, even if you only do it for 5 minutes, and that you shouldn't chew gum to avert the apocalypse. And I guess I'm thinking like most people are going to think that that's the wrong judgment about this counterfactual case.
Yeah, so I just denied that it would be so subtly different. I don't think that there's a one ingredient change that would lead to a chewing gum that literally involves no absorption or increased salivation, whatever, which both of those things were how I defended chewing gum before.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I did a little bit of research in writing the book to see like what gum is made out of. And everything I can tell is that, essential ingredients in gum involve gum bases, which are partially digested. And so it sounds like what you're describing is it's not something that at least is on the table right now. And I'm skeptical that there's a possible world that's close enough to grounded intuition like you need.
I don't know. I don't think you're doing justice to people's modal intuitions. I mean, I think it's quite easy to imagine, right? So we're imagining a squidgy substance that's sort of pleasant to play with in your mouth, and it just doesn't break down, right? So like, little bits don't come off. Okay, I think that's fairly easy to imagine. Like nothing goes in, you just chew it and spit it out. and we can also imagine that it had some taste that like counteracted the salivation effect. So like, you know, when you taste a certain taste, you're not going to salivate. I think this case is fairly easy to imagine, and I think that when the audience is entertaining this case, they're going to have the intuition that like, no, it would not be wrong to chew this substance for 3 minutes in order to avert the apocalypse, or even to like
So this
avert a small
flavor
pain.
that you're describing is not
Yeah.
absorbed on the tongue at all.
Yeah, I mean, wait, so like, yeah, I can imagine, I guess I can imagine like a flavor that doesn't have any nutritive effects, which is all you need, right? So it can be a flavor that doesn't like give me any nutrients. I mean,
I guess
surely
we're gonna
that's
have to understand
metaphysically
like what
possible.
is it, what's involved in a nutrient. So
You know,
I'm
like,
gonna be fairly broad. I'm gonna say
yeah.
absorption of outside things that have a contribution to physical health, and
Um,
so
I don't
the
think,
contribution could be
yeah.
pretty broad too. It doesn't have to just like lower your blood pressure or increase your eyesight or something like that. Like
Yeah, I mean, so it depends on what you mean. I mean, so like if I swallowed some dust, would you say that it so like there's some sense in which it's going to partake in my digestive system,
yeah,
but like I don't know, would you classify that as a contribution?
a very marginal one, a negligible one, but yeah, it's a contribution.
Sure. Okay.
So let me just make a general comment, because
Yeah.
I find this stuff fascinating, but this is at the same time, you know, the YouTube comments are rolling in, right? And
10
so
minutes of chewing gum.
let me just, because we're kind of skirting around differences in modal theory here, right? Obviously, and everything in philosophy is connected, right? So like, take someone like me. I'm actually generally a modal skeptic, right? I'm an essentialist, and I think that things have hidden de re necessities. I mean, obviously, right? Like, maybe there was a time when we thought there could have been ammonia-based water. There cannot be such a thing, right? So there's all these sorts of hidden necessities of things that causes me to have a pretty, a pretty broad like modal skepticism, right? So like, I wouldn't go in for these types of I can imagine or I can conceive, types of statements that are being brought about here. But I could understand why if somebody thinks that, consistent conceivability or something like that is actually a reliable guide to possibility. But I'm detecting a sort of like, Brian, it seems like you're kind of closer to me on this, right? There's just a sort of a modal impasse here, right? I don't know how to break through that without like totally reorienting this debate.
I'm sure we can break through this modal impasse. This will not be where this part of the discussion ends, I don't think.
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. Like maybe this is just something to like, let's acknowledge what's going on here. There's a wider, there's a wider issue. It's very interesting. But we'll just keep hitting the ball back and forth around. And I would like to avoid that to an extent if possible, right? Yeah.
It seems like you're only going to want to have a kind of case that's seen in the actual world, right? So like maybe not like you want like a type of case, but maybe not a token case that's seen in the actual world, because presumably you'll have examples that you bring up later on when we talk about sexual ethics more generally, and it'll be interesting to see like how real worldy your examples end up being. But okay, so sometimes I like chew my cuffs or like my clothes, I'll just like nibble the threads. And so this is something that people actually do, and I don't swallow any of it, I don't think. And so
I just had to tell my daughter to stop doing that this morning at Costco. Should I not have done that? I need to know, right?
I mean, like
she did rip her sleeve.
I mean, like Richard Swinburne has these kinds of examples where, like, you totally shouldn't destroy like a jumper that someone gave you because of gratitude to your parents. So I guess that's what grounded your daughter's obligation. But suppose I just like buy a cheap shirt and I sometimes like nibble the cuffs. Okay, so I take it that this is kind of a paradigm case of morally neutral behavior. But are you going to be committed to the view that this is not only pro tanto wrong, but categorically wrong to avert the apocalypse?
Yeah. So I guess I don't know enough about chewing on clothes. So like okay, so maybe like an example that I sometimes see is people who take plastic straws and they chew on those.
Sure.
And so maybe that's the closest real world case where because I don't know if anything's absorbed in plastic. If you're chewing on a plastic
Yeah.
straw,
But like, since you're not sure about it, right? Like, it's an open question whether it is.
yeah.
And so, like, you can easily imagine the world where it's not, given that it's an open question for you. And so I'm thinking, like, just suppose that that's what the scientist said.
Yeah. I guess because I'd have to think about whether chewing a plastic straw just for the sake of the enjoyment of chewing would be wrong. And
Yeah.
and so I'm thinking through this on the fly, and my initial inclination, my intuition is to say, no, it's not wrong. That seems perfectly permissible. And so I'm trying to figure out, am I committed to saying that it is wrong? So why would I be committed to saying it is wrong? It's because it involves chewing in a way that's directed away from nourishment. It's not obvious to me that it's an act of chewing directed away from nourishment, because it's intended as an abortive act, and so an end won't be achieved by it except for but see, I guess I don't know. I've never chewed a straw. Is there an increase in salivation?
I mean, I guess I don't remember, but like, suppose I'm like a Zen monk and I can kind of control how much I salivate.
Well, see, that's getting too far fetched. I'm just talking about like
I mean,
the
okay,
regular person
fine.
that I see in sheets
Yeah.
chewing on a straw. What's going on there?
Yeah. I mean, do people ever have disorders that stop them from salivating as much as they should?
Well, even if that a disorder wouldn't stop it, because that just would mean that a person's failing.
Okay, yeah. Fine.
Like that wouldn't be their fault. They're not directing
Sure.
their power away from its end. And so I don't know enough about chewing straws. Mike, okay, so if it increases salivation, that makes it a little easier to use the same explanation that I previously used for chewing gum, for chewing a straw, namely that increased salivation is good for dental health, and this could be this is like brushing your teeth.
Yeah.
That chewing on this is beneficial, even if literally nothing's absorbed. Now, most of the time when you brush your teeth, you probably swallow some of the toothpaste, and you might break it down in your mouth too. But let's suppose that there were a toothpaste that was entirely neutral and yet still protected your teeth. That seems good for your dental health, and dental health is one of the, you might say, subgoods of physical health, which nourishment is aimed at. And so if chewing a straw is good for dental health, then it's one of the subservient goods to physical health, and likewise is appropriate.
Sure. Okay. And so like the reason it's good to salivate is for dental health, and like dental health is one of those things that's it's a good that's kind of like parasitic on a broader like a broader faculty or power, namely like the faculty of nutrition. So the reason it's good to have good dental health is sort of ultimately derivatively because you have this faculty of nutrition and all the parts need to be in good order, something like that.
Yeah, for your physical health. Yeah.
Okay, so then maybe we should skip over to sex. See if your answer in the case of chewing a straw or using this toothpaste is not going to kind of open the door to certain intrinsically non-procreative sex acts. So I take it like sexual health is a thing, and so like you might think that the end of sexual health is being kind of in prime shape to be able to have heterosexual coital sex with your spouse to completion, of the kind that's kind of aimed towards reproduction, right?
Something like
I mean, if that's the end of sex, then
continue your point.
Yeah, go on.
Oh,
okay.
Sorry. I don't know about what to say about sexual health by itself.
Sure.
it seems like a good.
Yeah, but like, in the same way that salivation is like good, but it's derivative of this sort of broader type of health, right? So
Yeah, it's a
dental health is good
configuratory
because,
good that's a part of a larger good.
yeah, right. And so, okay, so like, so suppose someone, suppose a woman is such that like she sort of finds it hard to like get wet enough before sex, just like by the sort of normal amounts of foreplay, and so like the thing that happens to work for her is if she masturbates to completion beforehand by herself, and then has sex. Um, so it seems like a similar thing could be said of this case, right? So in the same way that you're kind of lubing up your mouth when you chew chewing gum or chew a straw, and that's why it's okay, you could like lube up yourself by masturbating to completion before sex. Um, and so I'm wondering like why one is wrong on natural law theory, but the other is permissible.
Yeah, I mean, I'll ignore for the moment that there's so many other ways to accomplish this end.
Yeah, but like someone could be sort of psychologically such that this is this is what works for them.
Yeah, but they do make lubricants, so
Yeah, sure, but like you might be allergic to all the like or like it could be
all right,
prior
now,
to
now
the
my modal
invention of lube.
skepticism is kind of
Oh,
kicking in here.
oh no, okay. So I don't think it needs to, right? Because in the
Yeah.
past, these sophisticated lubricants didn't exist. Some people may have like lived in places where this technology wasn't available to them. So like there are actual world cases that this is
I
relevant
mean,
to.
egg whites were used, so it's hard to.
No eggs in this. Like people haven't always had eggs or like
True,
figured out
chickens
that
are a
there's a
medieval
yeah,
invention.
right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Um, so there could be cases like this. Now, I guess I don't see, even in the real world cases, why it has to be, why the act has to reach orgasm before, you know, a woman is ready to go for an ordinary sexual act, versus stopping short of that. Now, stopping short of that in the act of procreative sex seems perfectly permissible.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not
Yeah.
sure, given the way in which, so a man's side of sexual finality involves a coincidence of orgasm and sperm ejection.
Yep.
A woman's egg does not have any direct link to her orgasm. And so orgasming for a woman is not the same as orgasming for a man. So a man achieving orgasm outside of a procreative act would be directing that act away from the end of procreation. It's not clear to me that a woman achieving orgasm in a timing so close to the procreative act would be aiming away from procreation. And so, because if what she's trying to do is prepare herself for a procreative act, it's not obvious to me. And, unless you think I'm just biting the bullet here, moral theology is something that I'm quite interested in. And most of the moral manuals say that a woman achieving orgasm immediately before or immediately after the man's achieving orgasm is perfectly permissible.
Sure. Okay. So let's.
And for the reasons I just said, because it's not as though her egg is released at orgasm. And so if the orgasm is just timed for sexual satisfaction, the overall sexual act, which is this combination of activities, is still aimed at procreation.
Yeah. So in that case, right, it seems like what's in her head at the time matters on your view. So like what her psychological intentions are.
Yeah.
And so okay, I think that if typically when I chew a straw, or chew my shirt, or chew gum, or drink Diet Coke, the aim in my head has nothing to do with salivation. It's just because like this is kind of pleasant and entertaining.
Yeah.
And so we can imagine a parallel case where she does this because it's pleasant and entertaining, but as a matter of fact, it's good for her sexual health because it will allow her to have sex after.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, like, what's the difference?
Yeah, enjoying sex is not bad. And engaging in sex for its enjoyable features is not bad.
Sure.
And the reason why is because the end of enjoyment can overlap with the end of procreation. And so the subjective end one has, insofar as it's compatible, right, in some sort of like metaphysical or ontological sense with the end of the power, as long as your power is being used towards its end, the intention, as long as the intention overlaps with the end of the power, there's going to be lots of intentions that are overlapping and likewise compatible with the natural use of that power. So yeah, so she could do this and, you might say focus on the enjoyable aspects of it. And as long as it's appropriately directed towards procreation, her intention has not gone wrong.
Yeah. So even if like the end of procreation isn't in her mind.
Yeah, I mean, look, you don't think about babies during sex. That's weird.
Sure. Okay. So in that case, why not sort of delay the event, right? So part of sexual health is also psychological. So you can imagine, like, some people might find it easier to have sex once they've like discovered themselves psychologically, and so we can imagine a woman who like fantasizes about her spouse and only her spouse in an appropriate way, and then masturbates like a week beforehand. And so I take it on your view that will be wrong, but I'm
Yeah, that's
wondering
right. Because
I'm wondering like why that's wrong.
yeah, it doesn't seem in any like broad sense related to procreation.
Oh, I mean, so like you might think that like maybe she just won't be able to become aroused unless she's explored herself psychologically in the right kind of way.
That just doesn't seem realistic.
Um, but like it could happen, I mean,
I mean, I think sexual arousal is a basic function. It's hard for me to imagine that the only way that someone can attain sexual arousal is by using their sexual powers against their natural ends.
well, I mean, so like that maybe slightly begs the question because I was wondering whether that would use the sexual power against its natural ends.
Okay.
Given that like chewing a plastic straw with the goal of pleasure in mind doesn't use that faculty against its natural ends.
Yeah. So I guess in the first case, the reason why I didn't think that my intuition, and I could be wrong, my intuition about the first case that you mentioned is that the use of natural powers is always episodic. And the way that I was thinking of the first case is that the episode is not over. And so you might think that the way we analyze whether the episode was appropriately aimed at its end or not is if the episodic completion involves you might say appropriate aim towards the end. So I guess I don't think it's realistic to think of the episode of masturbating 1 week before procreative sex as just part of one really long sexual episode, unless the arousal continues like literally for a week. But that seems so far-fetched for human nature that any intuitions garnered from it won't be, I guess, very useful.
Yeah, I mean, so I wasn't thinking that the arousal would last for a week. I was
Yeah.
thinking that like this act sort of like unlocks her in the right way, and so that makes it easier for her to have sex with her husband. So like like maybe the husband isn't very attractive, and so to be aroused by him, she has to like think about him in a certain way, and she needs to do that beforehand because like the pressure of the sex itself won't allow her to get in her head in the right way. So I just think it's easy to imagine a case like this, and so like the other thing you said had to do with the kind of individuation of actions. So like, is this
Yeah.
is this like two actions or one long
Right.
action? And I mean, I guess I kind of think like there's not really a fact of the matter, and like our judgment of the case probably shouldn't hinge on how we individuate actions.
Now that begs the question against natural law, because it
Sure.
does matter quite a bit, the individuation of acts. So like here's an example, like supposing that we were a very different species and sexual episodes for us, like perhaps we engaged in them far less frequently, but then when we engaged in them, it might take up to 2 weeks for a single procreative act. And like, so arousal involved like a very slow buildup, and then once it was there, it would last for a really, really long time. Then what you're describing seems realistic because there you've got a plausible story according to which it's the same episode all throughout. But that's just not the way human beings operate. So So yeah, so it seems like a completed sexual act aimed away from procreation.
Yeah.
Now, it's an individual as an individual act analyzed in isolation. It's aimed away from procreation. Now, an act aimed away from procreation, you're trying to say, could be more generally aimed towards procreation. And I'm going to say, okay, yeah, but each individual episode has to use the power towards its natural end, and the overall goal should be. So to use like a very similar example, if the only way that a person could become aroused is by looking at, I don't know, like dogs being drowned in a bucket, and so getting off while watching dogs being drowned in a bucket is the only way he can have procreative sex with his wife later that week. We're just going to say, hey, you know what, that guy, he needs counseling. He can't,
Yeah, but like for other reasons, right? I mean, the reason some people might object to somebody becoming aroused to dogs drowning in a bucket, probably has more to do with like psychological facts about the kind of person and the nature of the thing they're viewing, and so like it at least it might turn out to be objectionable for reasons other than like masturbating to the image of your husband might be.
Or just, I mean, I guess I'm trying to think about intuitions where people see the individuation of the first episode as important, even if it becomes a means to something productive later on. And so people are like, yeah, that's not the same thing. That's an episode in and of itself, and that guy shouldn't have engaged in that. And I'm going to say the same thing about the woman, is even though there might be some further goals that it accomplishes, the individual episode is wrong. Now, I don't expect people to have the same intuitions as me, which is why I use a more intuitively clear case, just to illustrate that it does seem like individuation matters.
Right, but so like the intuition that you were playing on there, so regardless of whether intuition matters, it seemed like the intuition you were playing on didn't have to do with individuation. So people would object to a man using the image of like dogs, even if it were part of this one act of sex with his wife, right? And so like the thing that people were responding to wasn't about the individuation of actions, it's about the objectionability of using an image of dogs to arouse yourself.
Yeah, okay, so I guess I agree with you insofar as like if the guy's foreplay in the one sexual act involved first looking at puppy death porn and then within 15 minutes going in with his wife. So I guess to use an example where that's not plausibly the driver of the intuition, if a man could only have sex, perhaps he's found his wife unattractive, and so now the only thing that he can do is masturbate to pictures of other women first, to kind of like make him more interested in sex to begin with. I'd say it's still wrong, even if somehow later on he's more open to, spousal.
Right. But yeah, so again, like regardless of whether the individuations of actions matter, the thing we're responding to in that case doesn't have to do with the individuation of actions, and I think I can show that by just asking you to imagine a case where during the act of sex with his wife, he was using pictures of other women to arouse himself. So people who had the intuition that it was wrong for him to use pictures of other women beforehand are going to have the same intuition about using pictures of women during the act. And
You're right.
So what? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm trying to think of any other cases that are just going to ground. I don't want to just say as a brute fact, there are episodic uses of powers, and we know that because like we understand basic biology. So I guess I think of each of these as an episodic individuated act, and every act has to be aimed at procreation, not just as the overall goal of your life for later this week, but in the episode itself.
Yeah. I mean, it just seems like in some of these cases, it doesn't seem like there's obviously a fact of the matter about whether it's like one episode or two. Like, so she does it an hour beforehand to like unlock a certain sexual fantasy about her husband, and then she can have sex, whereas before she couldn't. And seems like this could happen. It's not so far flung. People have all kinds of psychologies. Like humans are very diverse. And regardless of whether we ultimately judge that to be right or wrong, I'm wondering, why that would be impermissible, if it's permissible to chew your sleeve.
Okay, so to to retrace, you say
Yeah.
there's no fact of the matter about episodes.
Yeah, so like at least in some cases there's no. So I don't even need to commit to the view that like there's never any fact of the matter about like when one episode is part of another episode. I just need to think like there's no like joint carving division, or at least one that matters morally in some
I guess.
cases. Yeah.
So let me just ask a question. It seems like we're not talking about spiritual beings where you have to like think about the intellect. Like there's biological processes that these powers intervene on, and so you might think it's just like it's pretty easily discoverable biologically whether the person is has completed their sexual act or not.
Oh, so like in one sense, it was completed in the cases I gave it, right? So
Yeah.
she masturbates to completion before a sex act, but the thought would be that she was doing that in order to like promote her overall sexual health.
Yeah.
And so like just as you can chew your sleeve without ingesting any nutrients in order to like promote your overall dental health, which promotes your overall the overall flourishing of your nutritive faculty. I was thinking like what or why on your view is it impermissible like an hour before sex to masturbate to completion in service of like your overall sexual health? Because you know the people who like the sexologists who advocate masturbation, typically do so on the grounds that like it's good for your sexual health in the kinds of ways that I've described, at least sometimes, right? And so that's going to be the kind of thing that a liberal about sexual ethics will say.
Yeah. So I guess again, focusing on maybe the harder case, which is women, not men. Men are really easy because the episode has a sort of like fairly well defined beginning and end.
I actually don't know like what the difference would be. I mean, it's obviously like. Yeah, but like I mean, it's vague when ejaculation begins and ends, and it's also vague when an orgasm begins and ends.
I mean, yeah, vague in some sense, but it's
like
not
it's vague. Yeah.
I mean, like, I mean, it seems like vagueness admits of degrees, and so
well, maybe, but
some things are really vague. Maybe heaps. Yeah, baldness, beards. I don't know, but it seems like there's a natural sense in which a man and a woman know when they're done, and so if I was to try to do like some sort of time slice and be like, okay, it's quite now. Maybe that'd be a little bit arbitrary. Maybe it could have been split second before, split second after. But for the audience who's had sex before, most of them know when they started and when they finished, and it's not
yeah,
that
sure. But like I mean, I was wondering why you thought that was like very different for women, right? I mean, there's kind of like an end to masturbation.
Yeah, well, I guess the reason why is because for a man, the episodic completion ends as soon as the ejaculation finishes, and so like there's 10 seconds later, it's really obvious you're done. And so for a woman, it may not be quite as obvious. Nothing's ejected. There's no biological completion in the same way. And if she remained aroused for an hour after engaging in masturbation, let's say that her husband and her engage in a really, like a sort of marathon sex session where masturbation ended an hour ago and they're still at it an hour later, it doesn't seem wrong to me. I don't think it's plausible human nature a week before. And so there it seems like the episode is finished insofar as like the sexual powers are no longer being used for like, I don't know, 6.5 days. And then they are started over again.
Yeah, I mean, so like the case about like the case where it's waiting a week is one where like you unlock a sexual fantasy and like once you've unlocked it, it's there, but like you needed to kind of discover it first, and like in that case, like it seems like it's not going to matter. Like you don't need to be sort of constantly thinking about the sex act in the build up. The thought is like just like chewing your sleeve is going to help like lubricate your mouth, and is sort of good for your overall nutritive health. It's not obvious to me why this solo act of masturbation couldn't be permissible.
So why can't you just say? I mean, it seems to me like the reason why it's wrong is pretty straightforward on my account. It's a completed episodic act aimed away from procreation. And the things that you're using to justify it don't require it to actually hit completion. And so my objection is it's completed, it's an episode. I think your response is there's no such thing as episodes, or at least they're so vague as to be practically unhelpful for me. I guess the thing that I like, if I'm going to try to build common ground with you, I'd say if there is something good coming out of that initial episode, it can be detached from a completed sexual act. So this fantasy or something like that, this hook that can help her have sex with her husband, she didn't need to reach orgasm in order to preserve that thought in her mind for a week. And I guess if you think, oh no, yes, she does, I just say modal skepticism here. It just doesn't sound like a plausible account of human nature.
Yeah, I mean, we might have slightly different priors about human nature, but I don't think the debate, at least in respect of this case, but I don't think the debate will bottom out there. I mean,
if that were true of her, and I don't believe that there are women that are like, I don't think if this is realistic, but
10
supposing
billion people. I mean, like,
yeah, it's the same nature though.
Okay.
Yeah. So, supposing that really were necessary for her, I'd just say, well, that's unfortunate. It's still a wrong act.
Yeah, right. I mean,
because of the episodic nature.
Fine. I mean, I guess what I was thinking was like we'd need to sort of come up with a principle that applied to like chewing your shirt that also applied to masturbation, and it's still not entirely clear. But I mean, maybe we should move on to something else. Like maybe you wanted to push me on something that I think or whatever, or we can talk about a different objection.
Yeah, you can talk about different objections. I think
Sure.
it'd be fine to just focus on natural law because it sounds like it would probably involve some piecing together to think about what your alternative view on sexual ethics would be.
Yeah.
I guess one thing for the audience and maybe not you, but one advantage to what I'm saying about these episodic instances of sexual acts is I can explain really nicely and very neatly why it's absolutely wrong to have sex with a corpse, to have sex with your dog, to get off while eating someone's corpse, and to have sex with your let's say biological mother that you haven't seen since you were 1.5 and then were reunited with, and you both experienced strong sexual arousal at each other. I can explain all that really easily. Alternative views just don't have a natural and neat way to explain it. And even by your own admission, you're going to say like there's a range of cases where each of these kinds of acts is permissible.
Yeah.
So there is a benefit to if the audience is like, oh, let's chewing the straw, that just seems weird. Why would I ever endorse a view like that?
Yeah.
Well, there might be some reasons. I don't even know that I've bitten any bullets, but suppose I did, there'd be some nice takeaways, even if I did.
Yeah, I mean, so like anyone who thinks that you can just like imagine like what if chewing gum were different, or like and make valid,
but like really radically different, not just like a little bit different.
Yeah, sure, but like it's the kind of different where somebody could have just had the false belief that this was how chewing gum actually worked, and then like reacted to my case like that. And you might think that like the truth of their judgment about actual world chewing gum wasn't linked to like the essence of chewing gum because it wasn't like epistemically accessible to them whether chewing gum like helped your digestion a little bit and helped you salivate. Like some things you can just know about their natures by observing them, but some things presumably you don't. And I was thinking that like people's intuitive reactions with respect to chewing gum plausibly won't have been caused by a sort of unconscious perception of how chewing gum works at a molecular level. What it was caused by was just like, they believed certain things about chewing gum and they had an intuition based on those stipulations.
If I have to bite any bullets, it would just be that those people are mistaken, but they're not mistaken in their more fundamental intuition that chewing gum and sugar-free sodas are okay.
So if I have to bite any bullets,
it's just that some people are mistaken. But I don't think that's the real driving intuition. I think the driving intuition I can endorse.
Yeah. I mean, so I guess your response to the chewing gum objection surprised me a little bit. I didn't expect your response to be so heavily contingent on empirical facts about chewing gum and Diet Coke. I mean, so like when you read other classical natural law theorists, they put the point slightly differently, and it may be that this is ultimately what you're saying. But for example, like Timothy Shao in his response to the chewing gum objection, his reply is like, look, when you chew chewing gum in moderation, for 10 minutes or something, because the good of the function of chewing is like a derivative of the overall good of the function of nutrition. Chewing gum doesn't harm the overall good of that faculty, because like it's not going to cause you to be malnourished, right? If you only do it for 10 minutes, because you'll still have your 3 square meals of the day. But he says if you chew it excessively, you chew it for through breakfast and lunch and dinner, then it's wrong, categorically wrong, runs afoul of the perverted faculty argument. I mean, is that your view put differently, or is that a different kind of response?
Some parts of it I like, some parts of it I don't.
Yeah.
So the parts that I like are that he's thinking about health as the reason why chewing gum is okay, because that is something I said. I'm hesitant to say it's okay because it doesn't harm your health. I kind of wanted to say it was good and appropriate because it actually benefited your health. And so it's an act of eating that is, it's abortive in a certain way, I think. But then if you remember, I said, I'm not sure if it's abortive or not, because it may be that you've done everything you can do with that gum, and you have benefited your health. And so sometimes you just don't have to get food in the stomach to have appropriately achieved part of nourishment.
Yeah.
So
but like, but just to be clear, like you do think that if in fact the chewing gum didn't have these like effects on salivation, it would be categorically wrong to avert the apocalypse. And like I'm not asking whether that intuition is reliable. So like people will find that counterintuitive. You're saying that intuition is not reliable because it's completely far flung. It's like it's like very far from the actual world. Fine,
chewing
but
a straw seemed like this was the closest example that we came to. And I guess the reason I thought chewing the straw versus your shirt is because it seems like shirts are a little bit less durable, and so you would likely eating a little shirt, whether you know it or not. Whereas the plastic of a straw is much more plausibly not digested and not even absorbed through the act of chewing.
But I mean, what you said about plastic straws was that it's still permissible because it causes you to salivate a little bit, right?
I mean, that's my inclination, is to think that this is probably good for dental health, but I just don't know enough about it. I don't choose straws.
But then I would think I was just asking whether, like, if in fact it didn't cause you to salivate, like, that's an open question, whether it would be categorically wrong to chew a straw.
I'd have to think, like, and you may be surprised that I care about the empirical details, but I think whether this befits nourishment is a matter of empirical detail, and so I am actually pretty concerned about what's going on there.
Yeah, that's fine.
I think people's intuitions about whether you can chew random stuff off the ground, or that they find hanging around their house, or their cuff. Maybe it's not very differential, but I guess maybe I feel like this is kind of a dead horse and we're still beating it.
But like, can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
Just so like, in cases where you can chew X, where like we're not imagining anything that we've encountered in the real world, cases where like you chew X, and in fact X doesn't benefit positively your nutritive faculty in any way, or like including with your dental health, you would say that will run afoul of the perverted faculty argument, right?
I don't know, because it's abortive, and so I have to think about more deeply the ethics of acts that are initially aimed away, or at least prima facie aimed away from the end of the power, but which are halted before the episode's natural completion.
Okay.
So I'm thinking, if you want to come up with a really easy example, you're going to have to come up with one where the episode's finished, and it finishes in a way where it's very fundamentally directed away from the natural end. And so I guess the reason I'm protesting here is because I think that there can be like brief acts that we do, which considered by themselves are not aimed, but it was not like you pick up a bite of food, it tastes disgusting, and you spit it out. Well, spitting out food is not aimed towards nourishment, but I think that was an abortive act of eating, and so I think something similar is going on there, and most of my work so far is focused on the episode's completion, rather than abortive, and so that's kind of why I don't want to come to a firm decision, because I don't think I've thought through the ethics of these abortive acts sufficiently.
Okay, yeah, we can leave that there. I mean, Pat, did you want to say something?
Yeah, sorry, I just tried to pause before I coughed in the microphone. I've spared you guys so far. I want to keep it that way. Yeah, a few things, and I want to make sure that you guys cover all the stuff that you want to cover before you get to my stuff. But I thought it might be interesting to hear your guys' thoughts. And I think Brian, maybe we discussed this years ago, but it's been so long since we had the chat that it might be worth retreading some of it. Of different considerations when it comes to moral theory selection. In general, I mean, a lot of what goes on today are kind of appeals to different intuitions, right?
Yeah.
And like, fair, I'm not one of those totally against intuitions guy, by no means. Like, one of the reasons that I do find myself attracted to natural law is when I look at all the things that it seems like it can secure for me. Yeah. I'm like, yeah, I'm pretty on board with all that. And when I look at the bullets that I might have to bite, I feel like at the worst, I'm like, okay, that isn't the worst thing in the world for me, right? And those are intuitions, like fair enough. Everyone does that, right? But obviously, I think it should be more than just that. So I would and this can just be an open discussion. You guys can take it anywhere else you want. But I know, Brian, you've put some stuff out here on this before.
Yeah.
So yeah, why don't we just think about that together?
Yeah, you want me to start kind of responding how I'm thinking of natural law? So so I guess there's two trends. And most of your audience may be actually more familiar with the current trend, which is dominant in applied ethics. And that is, you might say, like ethics from the ground up. And so, in the last 10 years or so, applied ethicists have increasingly spurned theory and are driven by case analysis. And they come up with principles of a sort of like mid-level applicability, which are divorced from any broader theory. And so then you begin to get this sort of piecemeal ethical theory, which lacks cohesion and simplicity. And so, I want to say I side with applied ethicists insofar as intuitions are important. But I think the intuitions that really should be driving moral theory are Morean intuitions. And these are intuitions, if your audience is not familiar with Morean intuitions, Morean fact, David Lewis once wrote, was a fact that we know better than any argument or any premise of an argument to the contrary. And so Morean facts are very important. They provide theory constraining data. And but I don't think that they just constrain our theories. I think they also should be deeply informing our theories, because they provide what I think to be the strongest possible evidence that a theory is right. So if a theory can explain well Morean data, it's very well supported, because the Morean data is just so epistemically privileged. And so I like applied ethics insofar as it looks at intuitions. I don't like applied ethics insofar as it looks at a variety of intuitions without acknowledging epistemic differences between the intuitions. And so I think what it leads to is moral theories that lack cohesion and simplicity. And so, I could, in under 200 words, in fact, under 30, explain to you all the most relevant principles to explain everything in morality. And I could explain that without exception or caveats or nuances that an undergraduate or even a high schooler couldn't grasp. Natural law is both simple and cohesive. And so I think it's very important when we're looking at, say, scientific theories, that we don't just look at individual pieces of data and explanations that can explain to this and to that, but which can explain those things and explain everything with relatively few principles. So I think natural law has one of the best balances of practical applicability. Like we're talking about whether a woman can masturbate a week before or an hour before. It's highly practical. And I have reasons why that are built deeply into the theory. So it's highly practical, but it's also very cohesive. And so this is the way I think of. I think we should have theories that can explain our intuitions, most especially the rock bottom Morean intuitions. But it should also be a theory that's by itself attractive. Amos, I don't know if you have rival views there or if it sounds good.
Yeah, I mean, my approach won't be that different. I guess. So, okay, it's true, exactly like you said, we should be engaging in this kind of reflexive equilibrium process where we're using our Morean intuitions, case judgments that are just really, really obvious and form our kind of normative bedrock, sorry. But also, we should aim to be kind of unifying and explaining some of them. We should want a theory that predicts some normative judgments as well. And I guess the difference between us is just that I'm more pessimistic that we've got a good theory yet, or at least I'm more pessimistic. Okay, more restrictedly, I'm more pessimistic that I know what the correct theory is. So yeah, it could be that like some guy in some university has actually outlined the correct normative ethical theory. But I think that this won't be true of you, but some people when they're considering natural law theory, like they'll sort of start out thinking, okay, natural law theory seems right. Let me consider the alternatives, and so they'll just like open an ethics textbook. The ethics textbook will be restricted to virtue ethics, Kantianism, and utilitarianism, and then they'll think, oh, these all have problems. I guess it's natural law theory, and I guess what I want to say is just that like there are so many ethical theories and ways of recombining ethical theories out there, and like one should be very, very cautious if one thinks that natural law theory has problems to just like side with natural law theory too quickly, because I would view that as giving up too early. I think like ethical theorizing is hard, and we should really explore all of our options, not just the ones in ethics textbooks, before like jumping on the natural law bandwagon if you think that it's kind of problematic. And I guess we haven't explored what I take to be the problems with natural law theory. I think like in both its new and classical variants, it just like does very badly. So we have a disagreement. I won't list off all of the issues that I take there to be with natural law theory. That wouldn't be fair because you don't have time to respond. But like, yeah, I guess I'd just caution people about signing on to an ethical theory too quickly. This is very, very hard, and smart and ethically decent people do disagree tremendously about about how easy it is to do normative ethics and about which theory makes sense.
Amos, are you familiar with the pessimistic meta-induction, this argument from the philosophy of science?
So is the thought that like most scientific theories have been wrong, and so yeah we should assume that any theory that we currently take to be popular is wrong as well.
Yeah, that seems like you could do the same thing on your view, because look, I agree with that smart and well-intentioned people struggle to come up with theories that compel attention from everyone and broad consensus. And I guess what I'd want to say is that doesn't really matter. And if it does matter, then it just leads to a parallel problem in ethics, namely, if we've been so conclusively wrong up to this point, we have no reason to think we'll ever be out of the mire, that ethics may be inscrutable. And that may be actually a conclusion you're comfortable with.
My actual attitude is sort of close to that without being that extreme. So
yeah.
I'm skeptical of people who claim to have like a complete normative ethical theory, but both because like whenever I've heard these fleshed out, I just end up thinking like, no, this is wrong. And also just like there's sort of a broad consensus that like the track record of ethical theorizing hasn't been very good. So like I'm not pessimistic about there being an ethical theory, but I am pessimistic about discovering a complete one in my lifetime. I think people underestimate how difficult it is to do normative ethics. I think it's really, really hard. And you know, I think like in some cases we haven't even tested the relevant normative theories against like the most important tests. There's one paper, as far as I'm aware, that tries to apply natural law theories to the puzzles in population ethics. And the puzzles in population ethics are like the hardest thing in ethics right now. And so I think with respect to natural law, I don't think we know what natural law says about the toughest problems. And everyone has to say things about these problems. So
Can I respond
yeah,
about
sure.
these the hardest problems or the toughest problems? I think these are just new and fatty problems. Like ethicists will bring up new and interesting problems, and I expect that to continue until human civilization ends. But I don't think that. I guess I'm highly, highly skeptical that the current inattention paid to population ethics problems is in any way reflective of, or rather, grounds for skepticism towards a theory. Because, like, if it is, then it seems like we should be really, really skeptical about every moral theory from now until eternity, on the expectation that new and interesting problems are going to continue to come forward, and we haven't yet tested all the extant moral theories against these new and interesting problems. I guess I think of problems as I think human civilization and intellect is abounding in new and interesting puzzles. And so if the test is we can't endorse a theory until all the most interesting or tough puzzles have been solved, we should never endorse a moral theory.
Yeah, I mean, it might be that like most people shouldn't endorse a moral theory. I'm comfortable with that conclusion. I think we do have a disagreement about how hard normative ethics is to get right.
I mean, I guess, what are you looking for? Like, at what point have we passed the finish line and we can be like, yes, this is it? When everybody agrees?
Not when everyone agrees. So, like, there are some people who are like professional philosophers, but I'm sort of not inclined to like care about their opinions much. Like, at least if I think they're sort of like not that good at philosophy. I mean, there are like a restricted number of philosophical idols who I'd look to, and I think, you know, like, wow, I take their opinions really seriously, and then like, you know, that may be kind of elitist, and I'm not one of the relevant idols, but like, I think like the peer disagreement that really matters happens in this like philosophical upper class, and like the views of like all philosophers may not matter to me.
So are you trying to say that when your philosophy gods agree, then we've passed the finish line?
Yeah, maybe when there's a consensus. It could also be that like you know, maybe I should just be a bit steadfast about my own views, and so maybe once I'm sort of happy that like I've enumerated a bunch of principles, they cohere relatively well. They also explain the data. They capture the intuitions that haven't been debunked by higher order considerations. And then, you know, when I pose these objections to the smartest people, they can't think of good objections to them. At that point, I might be happy tentatively endorsing a theory.
Sounds like me. Sounds like where I am.
Well, but you know what? I think that might be a good place just to hit pause today, gentlemen. If you're both happy with how things have gone so far, not that I don't want to continue it, but I do feel like garbage. And this has been this has been. I want to thank you both. Seriously, this has been a great chat. I've tried to pay attention as best as I could here. I'm sure you've seen me like hacking off with the microphone.
Hey, thanks for hosting, Pat.
No, seriously, thank you guys. I've been wanting to do more of these discussions. I've just been so busy. So when this came out, I was really happy to do it. Brian, as always, really appreciate you. Amos, it's been a delight. I really mean it. Thank you so much. It's been really great to have you here and for this thoughtful engagement. So before we say goodbye, I want to make sure you guys each get a chance one more time to just mention who you are, maybe some projects or where people can follow you, your Substack, all that good stuff. So why don't we go? Amos, why don't you go first this time, and then we'll finish with you, Brian. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So again, you know, my Substack is Going AWOL. Everyone should subscribe to the Substack.
Man, I need like a cooler last name. Well, I got Flynn. I guess I could be more like creative, like but everyone does like expects like in like Flynn or something like that. It's too cliche. Anyways.
And as for what I'm working on, I got a grant earlier in the year, partly to do work on natural or sexual ethics. So at some point I'll try and publish some things that I've been thinking of, both with respect to new and classical natural law theory. Brian has done some work on the ethics of lying. I'm currently writing a paper and then a book on the ethics of lying, about why it's okay to lie to children about Father Christmas. And other than that, no major projects cooking.
Well, you two definitely should be keeping in conversation then, for sure. Good, Brian. Yeah, but I know you got the book coming out, so why don't you mention that?
Yeah, that's right. So Sex and Theory will be out. My publisher indicates later this year, so this is 2025. People are watching it later on, and so it should be out in the fall, as well as the inaugural issue of the Journal of Natural Law. I don't have a Substack, and so you can just like send me an email or something if you want to know what I'm working on, or just check Phil Papers. Yeah, my online presence is basically just talking with Pat whenever he asks me to, really nicely. So, yeah.
I'll try to ask you a little bit more often. I've been so behind too, but it's good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Good. All right. Well,
sorry, maybe I should just say one thing. Given that people have sat through, an hour, 25-minute practical ethics debate, I had a YouTube channel like a year ago where I did interviews and hosted some debates on practical ethics, including some sexual ethics stuff. So there's a debate about the ethics of monogamy, about whether taxation is theft, between Michael Huemer and Philip Goff, ethics of abortion with Dustin Crummett. There are some cool videos people might be interested in. It's called Ends and Means. Maybe if you search my name, Ends and Means, it will come up.
Cool.
Yeah, and then I guess if anyone wanted another seemingly sprawling discussion of natural law, its positives and negatives, Joe Schmidt had hosted a discussion between me and Dustin Crummett. I don't know, it feels like a couple of years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. So they can find that too.
Cool. All right, guys. Thanks for tuning in. Please like, subscribe, all that good stuff that YouTube likes. I appreciate it.